Hello and welcome to Trismegistus Minis. Today we're going to be talking all about Deathwing. Deathwing Terminators, Deathwing Knights. I'm going to show you my method for painting them. One quick note for this. All of the work I'm doing today is done with an airbrush. Most of my battle line models are done with an airbrush to save time. So that will look something like this. This is just the initial airbrushing. However, you can definitely do the same effect by hand. This is all hand painted, all with a brush, and I use the same colors and fairly similar techniques. Throughout the video, I'll talk about the little differences between those. One more quick note before we start. All of my finished Deathwing models get a round of weathering to take them from something like this, that's just the base coat, to something like this, the weathered finished model. I'm going to do a separate video talking about the different weathering steps and methods that I use to paint these models, so stay tuned for that. Alright, so let's jump in. Alright, so here we have the model ready to go. It's been primed black with Vallejo surface primer. That can be a little bit finicky to work with. You can use whatever black primer you'd like. I've attached the shield and the helmet with just some poster putty or blue tack, and that'll make getting into the armor bits later on a lot easier. The shield will be a different color when the model's finished. Now we can look at the pre-shape process. So we're going to use Liquitex white ink, thinned 1:1 with Vallejo Airbrush thinner. This will get us a nice smooth finish. I'm going to be using my Iwata Eclipse 0.3mm airbrush for this process. The pre-shade is going to follow the general method of a zenithal highlight. However, I want to capture more of a spotlighting effect to bring out some intense highlights on specific parts of the model to make them stand out more and to bring a bit more contrast. To do that, I'm going to start by picking out those specific areas I want to be the brightest and applying a thin layer of white paint over them. As we keep building up this highlight, it's going to make sure that those areas stand out the most, and those areas become the focus. As you can see here, I'm working very thin with the ink through the airbrush. It's already thinned down 1:1, which makes sure the application is very smooth. And then on top of that, these thin layers really give us a lot of control in making sure the shadows aren't completely canceled out. It's very easy when you're airbrushing to be a little bit too eager and to lose all of the shadows when you're working. One thing I like about this method of picking out spot highlights and then keeping the shadows still fairly prominent is that we can really sell the size of the model. These Terminators are big, chunky boys, and having those bright highlights directly next to dark shadows, like you can see here on the knees and shoulder pads, allows the size and scale of the model to show a bit more. You'll see that for most of my airbrushing. I'm working very slow and deliberate, and a lot of that is because we're using this as our main paint application. Other than a few edge highlights, I don't really go in with a brush after this, so making sure we spend the time on these stages really pays off on having a clean result in the end model. If you are working without an airbrush, this is probably going to be the hardest phase to duplicate. My advice to you would be to get some kind of rattle can and just to do a general zenithal highlight where you prime black and then do a top-down spray of white over the model to get that gradient. Because of the colors we're going to be working with, the cream color or sand color plus the whites and very bright bone colors, getting a solid undercoat so we can apply very thin coats on top of that will help keep those colors smooth. Those light colors tend to have very strong pigments that stand out and are difficult to blend. For the last step, once I've got those spot highlights fairly well established, now I'm going to go in like you would with a zenithal highlight and spray white ink all over the model in wide strokes from kind of far away to make it all blend together. In doing this, we keep the dramatic spot highlights, but also consider the overall zenithal lighting or ambient lighting that would be present. Because we established those spot highlights first, as we build up progressive layers of white, those spots will remain the brightest. If you wanted to do the zenithal highlighting first and then pick out spots, that's totally okay. For me, thinking about the spots first allows me to really consider the parts of the model I want to stand out, where I find doing it the other way around tends to result in the model being brighter than I'd like it to be. And here we have the initial pre-shade done. One very important step now is to top coat the model. Ink is very delicate and we want to protect that layer. Next, I take Vallejo Game Dead White. You can use any white that covers well. I've had good luck with this one. And I'm going to stipple this all over the brightest highlights. The goal of this stage is to add a bit of texture and to bring a bit more vibrance to those bright spot highlights. We are not really trying to get the paint to be smooth or really even that refined at this point. It can be pretty rough, and the next several coats of paint through the airbrush will smooth this out. You can look at the video and determine how much of an effect this has. To me, it's subtle, but it is noticeable. But if you don't think that this is worth the time from the finished result, you can probably skip it. And as long as your ending highlights are fairly strong, you should be able to get a similar result without this step. This is a step that I would advise you skip if you're planning to paint this by hand. With the airbrush, we can cover over these rough spots very easily to smooth them out. By hand, it will take quite a lot of glazing to get it to where you want it to be. The goal of all of this pre-shading is to give ourselves a bit of a map to go off of for the next few layers of paint. Since everything we're doing is going to be very translucent, these subtle changes in value or even stark changes in value we have here will show through those layers to give us a more vibrant final result. It also gives us more of a guide to work with because these bright white spots will basically be visible until the very final steps of airbrushing. And there you have it. The stippling and base pre-shading is done. You can see how rough those highlights look now, but that will all be smoothed over for the end result. Now we're going to begin with the painting itself, and we're going to start by painting in the shadows. We're going to use Petroleum Gray from scale 75, thinned a little bit more than 1:1. We want it to be a pretty thin application, especially for scale 75 paints through the airbrush. Keeping them thin avoids issues like clogging and sputtering. Since these paints tend to be very matte, I've found that tip dry can be more of an issue with them. Whenever I airbrush, I like to mix my paint in a separate mixing tray and then put it into my airbrush. I found that this significantly reduces clogging and makes it much easier to gauge the consistency of the paint. For some brands, that's probably not necessary. If you're working with something like Vallejo Air, I always add additional thinner to that personally, but you can put that into your airbrush, mix it with the thinner in the cup with backflowing with no issues. Same usually goes for inks. But for scale 75 paints specifically, working with them in a separate cup and transferring them in removes a lot of the problems I've had with clogging. And now we're just going to work in relatively thin layers to emphasize the shadows. We want this nice, warmish purple tone to be worked into all of the recesses, and to take any areas we have black and convert them to our shadow tone. This is the same shadow tone I use across all elements of the model. Same for the green on the robes, for the red on different trims, and having it all be cohesive at this point really helps make the model look like it's in a cohesive light scheme. This will not be the last time we touch the shadows. At the very end, I like to reinforce the shadows one more time just to touch up areas where our airbrushing has maybe been a little bit too heavy-handed or cut back on them a little bit too much. At this stage, going a bit overboard with the shadows won't really do any damage. You're going to be covering over this with 2 or 3 more layers of paint for the midtone and highlights, so any overspray you have at this point is okay. If you want to do this technique with a brush, just work in thin glazes and follow your zenithal highlight as a guide to where the shadows should be laid in. You basically just want to be taking the darker gray and black tones from your zenithal and then glazing them over so that they turn into the petroleum gray color. Of course, if you don't have scale 75 paints, just find something that looks close enough, and I'm sure you'll have a good looking model at the end of the day. My choice of scale 75 paints mostly comes down to it being what I have on hand. I like the way they handle, so I bought the whole scale 75 range and tend to use it as my primary paint. But that's not to say it's the best, or that you can't get the same result with anything else. It just happens to be what I have around. Now we're going to take Thar Brown from scale 75, thinned in the same way that we did the Petroleum Gray. You can see here that my initial mix is actually a bit too thin, and takes quite a long time to get any coverage. So I'm going to go back in and remix that paint to be a little bit on the thicker side, just so it covers more smoothly. The important thing to note at this stage is that we're trying to get the balance between shadows and highlights kind of mapped out. So we already have the shadows established as our Petroleum Gray, and when we're going in with the Thar Brown, we want to make sure we don't completely overpower them. This color is going to be our foundation and act as the base for all of our highlight tones that go on top of it. If you're working with a brush, this is where things start to get more time consuming. You're going to want to start by gradually mixing Petroleum Gray and Thar Brown together to get the transitions between your shadows and highlights mapped out. This is a paint scheme where you really want to start dark and work your way up in small steps and glazes. Trying to do big jumps or blend things together will be pretty difficult because of how light the lightest pigments are. It's very possible to do it. My Belial and Terminator Captain were both entirely done by brush, but it does take a good bit of time. A problem you might encounter when you're working so thin with very light colors is that it's difficult to tell if the paint has actually gone down when you pull the trigger on the airbrush. And what I do to look for that is to try to find the wet spot that's a little bit more shiny. Because scale 75 paints are so matte when they go down, you can usually see where it's glistening a little bit. And once I see that, I immediately stop spraying and start blowing just air to dry it off. For all of these steps, I'm working in basically small pulses from the airbrush. A lot of air, small spurt of paint, and more air to dry it off. And here we have the adjusted mix of Thar Brown. So it's going down much thicker than before, not as much spidering. We don't need to worry about spraying in such thin layers that will spread out as quickly, and we can actually build up the color more efficiently. Getting your paint thinning right will take a lot of practice. I've been working with Thar Brown for quite a while through the airbrush. I've done 2 Dreadnoughts, more than 7 Terminators at this point, some Blade Guard veterans, and I still mess up the thinning pretty frequently. But you can see as we're laying down this mid-tone how everything's starting to come together. The shadows that we mapped out at the beginning and enforced with Petroleum Gray are really starting to stand out against the bright highlight sections, both from the initial airbrushing and from the brush stippling we did later. You can also see that the stippling has been toned down quite a bit. It's still present, you can still see it, and it's acting as a nice guide, but it's nowhere near as bright or rough as it was when it first went down. And there we go, the mid-tones all laid in. So as you can see, we still have some rough areas where we did the initial stippling, but you can start to see the direction the model is going in. We have pronounced shadows, pronounced highlights, and a nice mid-tone. Next, we're going to mix Thar Brown with white sands to get our first step of highlights. And now for my favorite step, where the model really comes together. So we're going to be putting on our first layer of highlights with a mix of Thar Brown and white sands. And we want to start off by working in small focused areas with this. But what this is going to do is turn that sandy tan tone of the Thar Brown into the nice rich bone color of the Deathwing. Adding in the white sands really does a lot to shift this from more of a khaki tone into that bone color we're looking for. It is easy to get a bit carried away with this step, so as always, work carefully, apply less than you think you need to, step back, look at the model, and then apply more. This is also the step where you'll really notice that the stippling is going away. By the end of this phase, that will all be completely smoothed out. You'll notice that throughout this process, I'm not being very careful to avoid the robes or other details, and that's mostly because these paints are so light that the green going on top of them won't really be affected by that color. If you wanted to apply this same technique to a different color scheme, say a red armor, you could still do the same thing and get similar results using red paints instead of tan, but what you'd want to consider is that the robes will need to be either grayed out or blacked out before you can paint the green over them. If you're doing this step by hand, what you're going to want to do is work on top of the base coat of Thar Brown and use very thin layers of Thar Brown mixed with progressively more white to build up to these highlights. When you're working with a brush, getting these highlights in and smooth is not especially difficult. It's really getting the transition between the Thar Brown and the Petroleum Gray that's the most difficult and time-consuming. Something I like about these Terminator models is that they're really a nice size for airbrushing. They have a lot of large, flat surfaces, there's usually space to get the airbrush into the recesses, and you can use this to great effect. For something like intercessors or other factions, the models tend to be a lot smaller, and getting this level of precision in with your airbrush can be much more difficult. If you plan to weather these models, you want to err on the side of being brighter than you need to. All of the weathering is going to take these highlights and tone it down significantly, so if you think that you want to go for a more grimdark look, but you still want the high contrast, definitely take this time to really push those highlights. One last note is that both of these paints, Thar Brown and White Sands, can be prone to sputtering. If you notice at all that your airbrush is starting to sputter or not spray as smoothly as you want to, quickly wipe the tip off with either water or alcohol, and that will stop you from getting little specks of paint into the shadows. Specks of white or Thar Brown will show up very clearly all over the model, so you want to avoid that as much as you can. You'll notice that I haven't really touched the mace at all in this painting process. The mace is going to be non-metallic metal, and so establishing the highlights and shadows is all something I need to consider when I'm painting with a brush. It's possible to lay down base layers for it with the airbrush, but I find that I generally paint over anything I've put down anyway, so I've stopped bothering. And for our last highlights, we're just doing pure white sands. You want to make sure when you're thinning this that the paint is controllable and going down in a nice glaze. Because this is pure white, it will very quickly overpower whatever you put it over. And what we're trying to do is just pick out those areas where we had the stippling earlier. At this point, the stippling is mostly gone, but you can still see the areas of increased brightness. You can really push this as far as you want to bring these highlights up. I use white sands as the universal highlight color across my army. That leaves pure white for things like edge highlights on non-metallic metal if I want to do something like that. However, you can use whatever color you'd like here as the brightest highlight. You absolutely could go back in with white ink here, thin it down and spray it in the same way I'm doing with the white sands to build up the highlight if you wanted to. One thing to note is that pure white tends to be pretty cold, and I like my Deathwing to have a warm feeling across the whole model. Using the white sands definitely brings the highlights up to that nice off-white, warm white feeling of being outdoors. And as always, we're taking our time and working slowly to bring this model together. By the nature of using an airbrush, this is already going to be pretty fast. I think this whole process with filming took me around 45 minutes, and if you're doing a batch of these, that'll be even faster. Alright, so now we have all the highlights mapped out, all the midtones done, and the shadows in place. If you wanted to, you could stop here, and I think you'd have a pretty good looking model, but I'm going to take Petroleum Gray one more time, and I'm going to thin it down and reinforce those shadows. As you can see, even though I was careful to avoid them, there's still a little bit of overspray, and the shadows were softened a bit. By bringing this petroleum gray in thin glazes back into the shadows, we're going to really bring out the contrast between our brightest highlights of white sand and our darkest shadows. And it's going to make this Terminator look like a big chonky boy. We're thinning this down much more than we did our previous applications of shadow. This is going to take a little bit of time to establish, but we want our glazes to be very controllable and very thin. We don't want this to overpower the transitions we have between our midtone and shadows already. We just want to take those darkest points and reinforce them. And by working thin, it guarantees that even if we have a little bit of overspray, it's not going to damage the work we've already done. And you can see I'm working in the same way I always do, just little pulses of paint followed by a lot of air. Little pulse, lot of air. And we're just going to go like this around the entire model, picking out those areas we want to be the darkest. If you worked by hand, you probably don't need to do this step. You're not really worried about overspray, and your shadows should be pretty well controlled by themselves. Something to note here is that my style of painting does give the model a bit more of a good face than the standard Games Workshop diffuse lighting scheme. When you look at the model from the side, you will see that there's a lot of darkness. There's a lot of details that have just been thrown into shadow. And for a tabletop piece, you might not want that. You might want the more diffuse lighting where everything is an even color. And you can still have that with this style, or with this technique. All you'd really need to do is take the Thar Brown and the highlight step and just expand it to cover more of the model. Another thing I really like about these Deathwing Knights is that all of the details tend to be on the front. You'll find with intercessors or other push-fit kits that they tend to have a lot of pouches and backpacks and just junk in the trunk. And that can be kind of a pain to paint. But with the Terminators, since everything's in the front, you can have a nice spotlight and have everything be well lit from one angle, and then not really need to pay a ton of attention to the back of the model. You can see the way I'm approaching it here, where the back of the model is getting highlights and it is getting shadows, but not nearly as much as the front. And it's gonna pretty much stay that way until the end. This method obviously won't win you a golden demon, but it looks fine for tabletop. I think it looks fine for display. Once you have a squad of 5 of these guys together, it's going to look pretty impressive. One thing I do want to point out at this point is if you're using a spotlighted lighting scheme, making sure your metallics fit with that is important. Things can start to look a little bit odd if your armor has very pronounced highlights and shadows, but then the other parts don't. You can see here that because of the poster putty, I was able to remove the head from the model, and I can paint in the shadows from a different angle just to make it a little bit more accessible. And here we are at the end with the shield attached with poster putty. As you can see, we've got a nice contrast between the highlights and shadows. Everything is smooth, and I'm quite happy with how this came out. It's not the fastest paint job, but it's by no means slow, especially if you do it with an airbrush, and I think the results are well worth it. And there you have it. Our little Deathwing guy is base coated and ready for the next steps. So here's another guy I've done a little bit more work on, and you can see the scheme comes together very nicely. When we're working on a color like this, it's important to take things slow. I've said it throughout the video, but because we're primarily relying on our airbrush to establish our contrast, we want to take things nice and gradual to make sure we keep those highlights and shadows and minimize the amount of brushwork we need to do in the future. I'm hoping to come back and make another video showing how to take these models with just the base airbrushing and do the weathering to bring them up to my finished Deathwing. If you made it this far, I hope you liked the video. Please let me know if you have any comments, and thank you so much for watching.